I can say what I damn well please. I'm 68 years of age, for goodness sake. I have no mortgage. Kind of like, I don't give a shit, to be quite honest. I have no HR person inviting me in to just have a quick word.
Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better. I'm your host, Tanya de Grunwald, an HR commentator who's watching, listening, and hopefully asking the right questions. Okay, let's get this working. Okay, hi everybody. I'm here today with Steve Harrison, who is something of a copywriting legend in the UK's advertising industry. He's a global creative director. He created his own very successful company, which he sold to WPP. He's won more Cannes Lions, which is the Oscars of the ad industry, in his discipline than any other creative director. And he's written 5 books all about advertising, all of which are much acclaimed. Did I get that right, Steve?
Kind of. I think the only reason you get called a legend is because people can't actually remember what you were famous for in the first place, usually. And so I was a creative director. I did found my own agency, and I did win more as a creative director Cannes Lions in my discipline than any other. But that was quite a while ago. But I have subsequently written several books, some of them, one of them particularly controversial, and I think I took delight in treading a bit of dirt into Adlan's carpet, so to speak.
What was that book called?
It was called Can't Sell, Won't Sell, Advertising, Politics and Culture Wars, Why Advertising Has Stopped Selling and Started Saving the World.
Can't imagine why that doesn't land well.
No.
Excellent. Well, listen, the fact that you're outspoken makes me absolutely warm to you. I think we need more outspoken people. So I'm really pleased. Thank you so much for joining us today. So this podcast is primarily aimed at HR professionals. So it might not be immediately obvious why I've invited you on. So let me just explain to everybody listening. There are 2 reasons. So the first reason is that, like many people, I've noticed that something seems to have gone awry in terms of how well organisations are functioning at the moment. So, for example, we're seeing lots of groupthink, a loss of focus, I think, on what the core goals are, and also vulnerability to fads. I don't tend to use the word woke very much, but some people do. But anything along the lines of sort of DEI and ESG, I think we all know what we're talking about there. So that seems to be happening kind of across industries. Much of the blame seems to be landing with HR and DEI. And I'm afraid to say that I think, yes, mistakes have definitely been made. However, I do think that's a little bit unfair, and I think it's an overly simplistic picture. And actually, the truth, I think, is much more interesting. I'm at the early stages of investigating this, but it looks to me like different things have gone wrong in different industries for all sorts of reasons, which are partly to do with how the industry has developed, how certain workplace cultures have evolved, where young talent has come from, what has happened to leadership, and why opportunities to course correct seem to have been missed. So I'm really keen to find out what's going on in all different industries. And I thought advertising was a good place to start, partly because my second reason for inviting you on is that I am still dying to ask you what for your take on the Jaguar advert, which I know is in November and everyone's moved on, but I think it's totally fascinating, and it created such a sort of caused such a stir in November. So I'm going to ask you in a second whether it was brilliant or bonkers, and get your take. So what do you think gives you such a valuable perspective on what isn't working in advertising at the moment? I mean, obviously you've seen an awful lot of change. Would you say that's the number one thing that gives you that perspective, or is there more? Is there something specifically about you, do you think?
I think there was my great hero, Howard Luck Gossage, the American copywriter from the 60s, said, I don't know who it was who discovered water, but it certainly wasn't a fish. And so what he meant was, if you're surrounded by your environment, if you're immersed in that environment, you aren't aware of your immersion in it. And I think I have the advantage of having worked in advertising for 30 years and confronted the task of creating advertising and managing creative departments, and in my case, my own agency. and taken on global roles as well. So I understand the personnel aspect, I understand the creative aspect of it. I understand what it's like to deal with people. And I think that because I no longer do that, because I'm a non-combatant, so to speak, I think that it does give me perhaps a good vantage point from which to view um, the machinations of the industry at the moment. It frees me up from having to conform to the groupthink. I can say what I damn well please. I'm 68 years of age, for goodness sake. I have no mortgage. Kind of like, kind of like, I don't give a shit, to be quite honest. I have no HR person inviting me in to just have a quick word.
And this interview is going to be all the richer for it, I can tell already. Um, um, what are the signs, do you think, that something isn't working in advertising at the moment? So from an outsider perspective, and I do have a bit of a media background as well in magazines, but it does look like the professional and creative teams within some brands seem to have lost touch with the consumer's values and the public mood. The Jaguar advert, I thought, was a really, really good example.
Yes.
The advert came out in November and it was very colourful and bright. I mean, it actually looked great. And
It was very gay in the old-fashioned
right.
sense of the word, and in the
And
modern sense of the word.
and the tagline was copy nothing, but it included rather a strange collection of kind of otherworldly looking people, and lots of abstract, rather meaningless phrases. I thought things like create exuberant, live vivid, delete ordinary, which might have been all right, I'm not sure, but there was no actual car in the advert. What can you give us your take? First of all, on the advert, kind of creatively, do you think it actually achieved whatever it was trying to achieve? And second of all, what do you think happened kind of behind the scenes for that to be the result?
As far as whether it achieved what it is intended to achieve, I would say that the aim was to build a brand and sell product, and I think it's too soon to say. So I don't know what the ultimate results will be, but the initial furore, I think, it was a general public response to a film that was typical of progressive political overreach. By that I mean a left-leaning clique in the marketing department were using their privileged access to the public, which advertising gives you, and not inconsiderable funds from the Jaguar Land Rover war chest in order to promote their progressive worldview. They've released a film to go along with on TikTok or Instagram, a film to go along with the launch. And it said, we're committed to fostering a diverse, inclusive and unified culture that is representative of not only the people who use our products, but a society in which we all live. I mean, as you said, they don't feature the car. There's a passing reference to the target audience in that little bit of blurb. But the main purpose of the advertisement was to promote the progressive outlook to the world. It was designed to preach to everybody the woke gospel of diversity and inclusion.
Do you think it was also, I think I read it as a bit of a kind of rejection of the sort of whatever they would think preceded the new way of doing things. It just seemed like a bit of a two fingers, frankly, to all their old customers and the sort of the traditional British way of life, whatever that means, because Jaguar is a fairly traditional brand, isn't it? Or has been up to this point. Was that why it landed so badly? Because it seemed to be rather sort of telling their previous customers, their existing customers, that they were dinosaurs. Or did you not get that? Was it just about promoting the new, or was it about rejecting the old?
I imagine that their exposure to their existing customers was minimal, and their exposure to their understanding of the mentality of their existing customers would be minimal. You've got to understand that advertising marketing world is a bubble. I think you saw this with the Bud Light farrago as well, when America's best-selling beer hired the trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney to promote the brand. And here, if you go, there's a fabulous piece of film on the old intranet by Martin Decoder, and he shows clips of Elisa Heinerscheid, the Bud Light marketing director, saying, "When I took over Bud Light, I took it over to evolve and elevate. It means inclusivity. It means shifting the tone. It means having a campaign that is truly inclusive and feels lighter and brighter. Representation is at the heart of evolution." And again, this kind of mindless doublespeak that was used to explain a disastrous piece of marketing resulted in Bud Light losing 25% of its sales over a 6-month period, and its number one spot as America's favorite beer.
The context that you've used the word progressive suggests that you don't view that as a positive thing. What can I just clarify exactly what you mean by progressive? I think I know, but just in case of people listening who are saying, well, actually, I'm progressive and I think it's good to be progressive. It means moving towards, being more inclusive and open-minded and being more welcoming to everybody and that sort of thing. Why are you using it in a way that doesn't sound positive?
I would say that we are a left-leaning industry, but it isn't the left of the redistribution of wealth. It isn't the left of Clause 4, for example.
What is Clause 4?
Clause 4 was about the redistribution of wealth, the ownership of the means of production. Good old, kind of class war socialism. The left of progressive, they still see capitalism as the enemy, but they see capitalism as the root cause of their holy trinity of sins, which is racism, sexism, and homophobia. And if you throw in the climate crisis onto the rap sheet as well, that's pretty much the 4 things that the left is against. And when I say that in advertising terms, the progressive left have come to control our creative output, or did come to control our creative output, it was that a lot of the advertising was aimed at using advertising messaging to combat racism, sexism, homophobia, and the climate crisis. There may not be anything particularly wrong with that, but my argument was that you shouldn't be using the client's dollar in order to promote your particular political viewpoint onto the public.
Yeah. Am I hearing correctly that you think that the advertising industry is anti-capitalist? And is that as much of an obvious problem as it sounds like it is? Because the advertising world is supposed to be, is it not, about selling stuff?
Most definitely. My book, Can't Sell, Won't Sell, was an argument that advertising should essentially stick to its knitting, and that is that it should focus upon their client's commercial purpose, which is building brands and selling things. Whereas for a 10-year period, we stopped selling and started saving the world. From 2012 to 2022, which I would have said was peak social purpose, there were very few dissenting voices to this groupthink.
Can you just explain exactly what social purpose means and how it sort of came about? Where did it come from, and why did it sort of take hold as it did?
Blimey, you've got to go back to the golden age of British advertising, when the ads that were done were as entertaining, if not more entertaining, than the programs they interrupted. And so they were welcome guests into people's households, and people could hum the jingles, they could quote the punchlines. I bet he drinks Carling Black Label, or happiness is a cigar called Hamlet, all that kind of stuff. And there would be 10 great agencies who stuck to this process and told clients, we need to research the market, the competition, write a brief it in. It takes a while to come up with an idea. You buy the idea, we steer it through production. Timely and costly, but very effective. Okay. And then digital comes in, and digital guys say, we can do you an ad in the morning and it can be on someone's screen by afternoon. And the clients goes, really? And the digital guys go, also, people can interact with it. They'll want to interact with it. This is called interactive advertising. And the consumer will be delighted to tell you what they think about the ads, and they'll help you with something called co-creation, and they'll have you. It's one big, kind of fabulous virtuous circle advertising. And clients thought this was absolutely lovely, cheap and fast and effective. So they're very worrying for advertising. Then along comes 2008, 2009 and the financial crisis. And suddenly budgets are going into digital. We'll put it all into digital. So the big creative shops, suddenly, who used to sit at the big table have now had their lunch stolen from them by the digital people. Then something that happened in 2008, 2009 came to Adlan's rescue, that the financial sector, who, if you remember, Occupy Wall Street, were hugely threatened by activists who were truly questioning the legitimacy of our financial institutions. The financial sector suddenly decide that from being the masters of the universe, they'll become the saviors of the universe. So the BlackRocks and the, kind of the JP Morgans suddenly start to be the arbiters of good in society. And through the promotion of ESG, it cascades into the rest of business. Advertising people realize that they also can be a force for good. Okay, so we would stop doing anything as mundane and exploitative and destructive of the environment as selling shit. That consumerism business, which actually is a bit dodgy, isn't it? Because it's depleting the Earth's resources, etc. We'll save the world. We'll start telling people how they can be good people. And growth, if we need to talk about growth, will come from good. Okay, so that is what social purpose was about. That suddenly all ads had to have the aim and objective of the ad was societal good. And if you sold a few things in the meantime, well, we won't talk about that very much, but kind of. Yeah.
Do you think there was a sense that the people themselves kind of didn't want to be the bad guys? Was it sort of personal as well, that they liked the idea of being kind of activists? Why was that appealing? Was there a status to that?
Well, I've told you we're very left leaning. We're a very progressive industry. As I say, 74% of people at the last election voted for left or centre-left parties.
It wasn't just from a business perspective that they wanted the companies. It wasn't just they wanted the companies to look good. It's the people themselves wanted to find that sort of meaning from their role. Suddenly.
Yes,
is that what you mean?
If you want a definition of the metropolitan privileged elite, it's the advertising industry. How cut off from the mainstream are they? 84% of agency workforce are aged 18 to 40. 84% are aged 18 to 40. 70% grew up in a household where the chief income earner was social grade AB, i.e. 70% grew up in the richest households in the UK. Okay, 63 had a parent with a professional background as opposed to 37% of the national average. 88% of a degree or a master's. Okay, of our BAME colleagues, 70% attended private school. So our BAME colleagues were just different coloured toffs, basically. And so this is a privileged, as far as metropolitan is concerned, of the big six agency networks, 90 to 95% of the personnel who work in those, like Omnicom, WPP, all of the household names, Saatchi, Ogilvy, 90 to 95% of the people who work in those agencies work in London. And so if you're dining out in Islington, right, and Chiswick with your friends, you're going to your dinner parties and everything, restaurants, whatever, you certainly don't want to admit to working in advertising or oiling the wheels of capitalist commerce. Lummin' heck, no, you do not. What you want to tell people is, I'm saving the planet, right? It just fitted perfectly with both their politics and their lifestyle.
Hi, everybody. Just a quick reminder to like and subscribe. It really helps new people to find us, and it means I can keep enticing great guests to join us. Also, a special message for HR professionals who are listening. If you enjoyed the podcast and would value speaking to other employers who share an appetite for robust discussion, do get in touch with me via LinkedIn. We'll be launching a new community soon, so this is your chance to shape those plans. Okay, I'll let you get back to the episode. So when you started out in advertising, it was a totally different world than what we're seeing now. You've said before it was just a completely different crowd. It was a much better mix of people. What was it like, and what changed so dramatically?
I would say the balance was a lot better. I think you'll find that the account people were hired, I think, because of their social fluidity, their clubbableness, their biddableness. They're comfortable comfort with clients who were from the same socioeconomic background. Okay, so they were university educated, maybe public school educated, grammar school educated. The creative department, again, a massive generalization, but you would have a good number of working class men and women in those and production and media would be run by media, especially barra boys and girls, ruthless, the media people are people who buy the TV spots, the space in newspapers. So yeah, with the exception possibly of the account people, there were a heck of a lot of working class people and lower middle class people involved. As a kind of as a consequence of that, you got a lot of mavericks and misfits in there. By that I mean people who couldn't find a niche in the brickwork of capitalism, you might call it. And yes, and people of all ages. I mean, this is going back a while now, but the three great heroes of advertising, Howard Gossage was 36 before he became a copywriter. David Ogilvy was 37. Bill Bernbach was 31. Kind of. So it took people. You didn't. People with a bit of life experience were welcome into the. I mean, I was 30 years of age before I became a trainee copywriter. 30.
So what changed in that time? It was because it's now quite a graduate destination. You mentioned a statistic about the number of graduates. How did that change? What happened?
It's the growth of the expansion of the remit of HR. And I think that nowadays HR is largely responsible for recruitment.
Did you used to be interviewed by an actual advertising person?
A creative director's job was to have a pile of books, kind of a book was people's portfolio of work before everything was online. And you would have it would be a constant flow of books coming in and out. And your job was to look through those books and see whether that person had promise, talent.
So quite senior people were taking responsibility for quite junior recruitment.
Oh, completely. And of course, I'd hasten to add you were colourblind as well. Apart from perhaps the clue of the name, you had no idea who this person was, what their age, sex, gender, sexual proclivity, kind of whatever was. You just looked at a book. It was a fabulous meritocracy, a colourblind meritocracy that you looked through, and shit. I would take anybody. I was desperate to attract people who would improve our creative product. And so the head of planning would look at planners, the head of client service would look at people coming into client service, and me as creative director would look at that. And then as the managing partner, as I was in my own agency, I would also interview all major hirings after they'd been through the mill.
So what we now see is early careers, which is probably outsourced. At least most of the early stages of that will be outsourced to HR.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I get that impression.
But senior people presumably don't come in until much later. So did the advertising industry suddenly decide that they needed more graduates? I mean, what was that about? Why were the mavericks and misfits that you mentioned earlier? Why were they suddenly not enough? What happened there?
I think again it's because when the task of recruiting new people into the industry fell to HR, the default was to graduate recruitment, that they would find the best and the brightest in the universities, kind of in the social sciences and the humanities and in the arts at university. And they were easier to target, I think. There would be a milk round, there would be a period at which the graduates would be graduating and looking for jobs. And the graduate recruitment process was an institution in Adlan. Every agency had a graduate recruitment program, to which they would get thousands of entries. But if you weren't a graduate, if you only had 6 GCSEs, you wouldn't get considered. It was the first falling off point for people with a different set of experiences in life, from a different point of view, to gain entry to an industry that used to welcome them and rely upon them.
I'm not sure how much you know about the work I've done in the past, but I did quite a lot of work campaigning for fair pay for interns,
Yeah,
particularly around between like 2010 and 2015, I would say.
yeah,
And advertising was certainly one of the industries which was pretty bad for it, and did improve a little bit actually, by taking steps to kind of to remove barriers. However, there's a policy called 1-for-1, which is that it's okay to give one unpaid internship to the child of a client or the friend of so and so,
really?
just as long as you also have one also for somebody, who has to be paid or whatever. So there was still kind of making excuses for it at that point. I always thought unpaid internships were bad because they're unfair and it removes opportunity from people, who may well be the best people for the job. But I didn't really think about the long-term impact on industries that were really, really socially not diverse.
Mm.
And I think you're beginning to see it in things like journalism as well. Advertising is a good example. Publishing is a good
Publishing.
example. I'd also say politics. So,
Yeah.
the harder you make it for regular people to get in, you kind of get what you deserve. I think in the end, your industry becomes what it deserves to be, really. And if you hoard opportunity and give opportunities to your kids and your friends' kids, and ultimately, I think it's difficult to complain about it when you think, oh, it's not really as good as it once was, because that's
Yeah.
probably why.
The nepotocracy is a disgrace, I think. But
So you mentioned that that there's lots more graduates coming in, and that possibly some of the ideas that they've got about making the world a better place in a very specific way, they might have picked up some of those ideas at university. Why do you think they wanted to get into advertising? Because it used to be I graduated in 2000. I think it was still the hangover from the kind of 90s and the Levi adverts and the Guinness adverts, and I thought advertising was quite cool, but I did not think that it was about selling stuff. I always understood that it was about selling stuff. Do you think something shifted and they sort of began to think that selling was in some way a bit naff? And what became their kind of motivator for going into advertising, and how did that change what advertising was in itself? Because young people shouldn't really have any power. I don't really understand how they had the power to sort of shift the dynamic in that way, if that's what you're saying happened.
you've got to realize that we suffer from an oversurplus of graduates nowadays. And that the late capitalism not only produces a lumpen proletariat who we have no use for, it also produces a lumpen group of supposedly semi-professional white-collar workers as well. And so they go into advertising possibly not because they love it anymore, but because it's a job, and it's related to communications media. They've graduated with humanities, social science, or arts degrees, and it's somewhere for them to go. I think. You see, the problem as well, Tanya, is that when I wanted to get into the industries, because what I was seeing on television was fabulous. I wanted to do the Hovis ad. I wanted to do the Carling ads. And now I don't think that it doesn't have that appeal now. That's what my point is, that they don't see anything on telly and go, I want to do that. But they do they have, I think, seen the social purpose work. And so youngsters will have seen this and thought, if this is advertising, I can change the world. I can have a huge influence here.
So social purpose advertising seems like a very big idea. Was it based on any evidence? And if not, then why did they go so big on it? There was presumably some evidence behind it at some point.
So advertising agencies decided that they're going to stop selling stuff or de-emphasize selling and emphasize saving the world. And their clients were in lockstep with them about it. The two biggest FMCG companies in the world, Procter & Gamble and Unilever, were the biggest advocates of social purpose, which made it very difficult for me, who was saying that actually this is a load of bunkum. I'll give you an example. Aline Santos, who is the executive vice president of global marketing at Unilever, said, a brand's role in culture has never been more important because people expect us to have a point of view. This is the time when we can see business and brands as the biggest healers in our society and our planet. We have to take responsibility. And then her CEO, Alain Jope, stands up at Cannes and says, we will dispose of brands that we feel are not able to stand for something more important than making your hair shiny, your skin soft, your clothes whiter, or your food tastier. So the fundamental things why someone would buy a brand, those are now just not to be considered. A brand had to stand for something much more important than that. Was there any evidence for this? There was a book called Grow by a man called Jim Stengel, which was the Bible for so, every time I'd have an argument with somebody, they'd wave Grow at me. And Jim Stengel had gone through 50,000 brands and proved that those which aimed at improving people's lives, the ones that had a purpose above and beyond commercial gain, were the ones that dominate the categories. And he listed 50 of these brands that had a purpose above and beyond that horrible, dirty commercial gain. And it was only until about 2020 when a man called Richard Shotton, in his book, The Choice Factory, just analysed these 50 and said, this is a load of bunkum. Kind of the figures just don't add up. He's saying that something like Moët and Chandon is one of those brands and its purpose is to help people celebrate things in life. It was just like, this isn't a social purpose. This is what champagne bleeding, it's all bleeding obvious what champagne does. So that one went, and then there was Edelman research. Everybody was quoting Edelman, kind of, Generation Z simply will not kind of tolerate brands that do not stand for some societal good. Edelman would ask what are open questions, leading questions like, would you boycott a brand who would do this? Would you use a brand who did that? Rather than saying proper research questions like, of these 10 reasons why this brand might be important in your life or would influence your decision at the point of purchase, value for money, reliability, customer service, carbon footprint, kind of like, usually people go value for money. They're just old-fashioned self-interest, kind of answers. And the altruistic ones would, by and large, come bottom of the list. So that's proper research. Edelman was leading the audience.
I've talked to Alex Edmonds about the McKinsey reports, which I think everyone thinks are much more substantial than it seems they are. I think there were 4 of those that came out about diversity and it being so great for business, but particularly demographic diversity. So I think they're all about race and sex, and there are 4 reports that came out, which all push that message. But I think the Edelman ones are really interesting because that whole, I remember that from being in the kind of early careers world. I remember going to an event at Havas People, and I wonder whether they got some of this from Havas Main. What do you call it? From the main part of Havas. Presumably all these ideas were sloshing around at the time, which were all about what Gen Z want as consumers. And I wonder whether some of that leaked into employer branding as well. Most people don't even know that employer branding is, but it's all about how you position yourself as a brand, as an employer, and particularly within early careers for young people, it's quite a big business. And I think they just lifted these ideas, which they assumed, I think, were built on solid data. They lifted the ideas that if this is what young people want as consumers, this is also what they'll want as employees, and therefore we have to do this in order to attract the brightest and the best people. It seems from what you're saying that the original research is pretty flimsy in the main anyway, but also that leap to, well, therefore they'll only work for brands that do all these things as well. And I think maybe it was a way of getting your consumer brand to tie in with your employer brands. It seemed like kind of, almost maximizing the spend. If you've got a good consumer brand, young people will want to come and work for you. So from an employer's perspective, a youth-focused consumer brand could only be helpful as an employer as well.
Yes. That's a fallacy as well. And particularly, I'll give you an example in the advertising industry. The major recruiter in the advertising industry is a company called Major Players. And every year they do a survey of the 13 disciplines within advertising, starting from client service to user experience, which is a digital discipline, kind of. And of the 13 disciplines, of the top 5 reasons why people have chosen their job, it's invariably it's pay, remuneration, work-life balance, flexibility, and the whole social purpose thing doesn't get a mention.
Yeah.
Never cited, never cited. You know, kind of its position on diversity never gets cited. Its position on a societal role never gets cited.
Is it true that things like training and opportunities to travel and things like that are pretty appealing to young people, or is that all pretty flimsy too?
Well, I'm afraid opportunities to travel nowadays is somewhat limited in the advertising industry, seeing as the days of flying off to wherever, you know, you're very lucky to be allowed out on the tube to go and see a client, never mind, you know, and kind of go to far-flung places. And training, I think in the major players survey, I think something like 27% of people reported that they'd not had an hour's training all year.
Gosh. So all these ideas were sort of sloshing around at the time based on some pretty flimsy data as far as we can see. They sort of felt true. They felt like they
Yeah,
should be true.
yeah. People wanted it to be true. They wanted it to be true, you know.
Yeah, there
It
was a
made them
mood.
feel good.
Yeah, there was a mood, there was a vibe. I don't know. I mean, I kind of probably was part of that myself. I don't know. I didn't really, it sort of felt
Right?
right.
Yeah.
So I think we kind of went along with it, but there were actual stories. So I remember from that time there was a story about Beyonce. This is actually from 2019. Beyonce decided to go with Adidas for her clothing range, but there was a story about the fact that she had met with Reebok, but walked out of the meeting because of the lack of diversity on the brand's team. Apparently, this is according to somebody else. I don't think she actually has ever confirmed this herself, but according to somebody else, she said, "Nobody in this room reflects my background, my skin color, and where I'm from, and what I want to do." And apparently walked out of the meeting. Now, it's one of those things where it almost doesn't matter if it's true, but it's the sort of thing that feels like it might be true, and it's pretty embarrassing for someone like Reebok, I would imagine. And there was truth to the fact that the advertising industry was pretty white and was pretty middle class at that time as well, and that they weren't completely mad to try and correct it. I think it sounds like they went over the top and they didn't have the data behind it, but they weren't completely mad to be a bit embarrassed about how undiverse it was. Do you think it's fair that there was something good in it at some point?
Yeah. The advertising industry became extremely embarrassed in 2020. She did that in 2019. That was just as the Me Too movement was breaking. So she probably did it possibly in response to the noise that was going on around Me Too. And then Black Lives Matter in 2020. And the industry collectively took the knee and blacked out all of their web pages for a day or a week or something. And then, unfortunately, the IPA, the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, published its census of the industry and found that the meager number of people from a BAME background working in the industry had in 2020 actually shrunk to even less than meager. And so there was, you know, kind of the industry did have to and still does have to do something about opening the doors to other people and not just the white middle class. So yeah, something definitely needed and needs to be done.
There's something quite unique, I think, to the advertising industry, which is the relationship between the client and the agency. I mean, I know we have clients and suppliers in every industry, but there's something particular about this client-agency relationship. And it sounds like, to me, you're saying that's changed quite a lot, and that as a result of the advent of digital, clients became more and more demanding and agencies ended up fighting harder and harder. And I understand there's the whole pitching model, isn't there? So you have to pitch for business. It sounds like it was more even in the past when the work was probably better paid for the time that was going into it. But something seems to have shifted there. So you mentioned that Procter and Gamble and Unilever, who own pretty much most of the kind of consumer brands in the supermarket, as far as I can see, they got all in with all the social purpose stuff. Did they then tell the agencies that they would only work with agencies or they would only consider working with agencies who were doing similar stuff. Was that it? And if so, was that ever considered an overreach?
I think I think as part of their commitment to ESG, they had to tidy up their supply chain, right? So agencies would have to commit to, I mean, obviously they'd sign the anti-slavery, kind of disclaimer and all of that kind of stuff. But the agencies had to be seen to be drinking the Kool-Aid, to be buying into this growth comes from good, force for good mentality. Kind of the agencies needed to be doing this. So that Procter and Gamble every year would go to their agencies with an open brief, right? With an open brief. And they go to the agencies on their roster, of which in London, they might have 6 or 7, and they would give them an open brief with a sizable budget aimed at producing a social purpose campaign that won at Cannes. Okay. So they were given money to produce advertising that won Oscars. It had no commercial purpose. It did have it. Its primary purpose was to prove that social purpose was an award-winning proposition. The whole industry just bought into this. In 2022, and Cannes is the Oscars, right? This is how you build your career. You win a Cannes Lion, a Grand Prix. Of the 43 Grand Prix that were handed out at Cannes in 2022, 85% of them had a social purpose or a cause-related strategy.
But this wasn't selling any stuff. No one's selling anything.
Its primary purpose was to have a societal benefit, not a consumer benefit. Kind of, it will wash you, like to Alan Jope stuff, make your hair softer, wash your clothes whiter, make your food tastier, forget all that kind of stuff. Kind of, that only 15% of Grand Prix had this commercial purpose. 85% had a social purpose or a cause.
So I need to ask how this is not impacting sales.
They could get away with it, Tanya, fundamentally because between 2012 and 2021, we had 0 interest rates. So a business could fund its growth on free money. So at that time, the marketing department was left to their own devices. And the films they were doing that were winning at Cannes were good for PR because it positioned the brand in a good light. But the fact that it wasn't making any money really didn't matter. Okay. When you have interest rates spiking at 11%, suddenly you can no longer fund a business on free money. You've actually got to start selling some shit. And that is when the tide turned. In 2022, Mark Pritchard was the chief brand officer at Procter, at P&G, who had been going to agencies and saying, do me a social purpose campaign. Told the Viva Tech conference, he said, the industry in general has just gone too far into good and potentially not paying enough attention to growth. And that growth comes before good. Growth now comes before good. And the order matters because first and foremost, we're in business. Our job is to innovate on our products. Our growth drives economic good. Growth drives jobs. Now more than ever, double down on making sure you have superiority from a product standpoint. And the corollary of that is do advertising that talks about the superior product. The product suddenly became the focus of the advertising. Suddenly, and Unilever did exactly the same thing.
So there's a change. You've detected a change in direction recently, but I'm not going to let the leadership get off that easy because we've talked a lot about young people and graduates and how they've come in with their funny ideas. We are supposed to be the grown-ups who help them into the world of work. So if they are difficult to work with, it's our fault in the same way as if your children are badly behaved, it's the parents' fault. So I'm kind of pushing back on the idea that young people are to blame for all of the problems that we see in all these many varied industries. Leadership seems to have failed within this industry. Is that correct? I don't understand how. I think of advertising agencies being run by middle-aged white guys who might be Tory voters, who might be Brexit voters, who might be, but who are fundamentally hard-nosed. and care about the money. How have they not said, hang on a second, all this fluffy nonsense that the young ones are into, it's not selling any stuff. We need to go in a different direction. Why didn't they push back sooner?
Across all of our institutions failed us. Our trade press, the editors, the chief editors of our trade press, our associations failed us. The Advertising Association, the IPA, the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, who had previously been renowned for their razor-like focus upon profitability, in 2022 changed the criteria for their effectiveness advertising in order to take financial results out of the criteria and give social purpose advertising the opportunity to win awards. They changed the rules. D&AD is if this Cannes is the Oscars, D&AD is the Golden Globes, right? Okay, so D&AD is probably the most respected awards body in the world. Okay, and in a podcast, Tim Lindsay, this is the chairman of D&AD, it says, and it relates to me, I am very keen to keep pushing this agenda forward. Despite what people like Steve may feel and think, there are people like him in the business who think it's just a lot of lefty nonsense, but I don't really care about that anymore. This is the chairman of D&AD, right? There was no one saying, this is not your remit. Stick to your knitting. Kind of the trade press didn't do it. Our associations didn't do it. Our awards ceremonies didn't do it. Our network bosses didn't do it. I was asked to work on GB News, right? When they launched. And I was working with a agency on this work, and we got to the stage where the posters had been bought and they were going up all over the country. And then I didn't hear anything from my client for a week. Eventually they got in touch with me and said that they had been instructed by the Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of the holding company, which owns that agency and hundreds of agencies around the world as well, that nobody in that network would work on GB News because of its political stance. They were to be blackballed.
This is an agency dumping the client.
Oh, yeah. The agency dumping GB News, yeah.
Because they didn't like the GB News.
Because they didn't like the politics, yeah. So when you say, were the bosses to blame? Damn right. Damn right they were to blame. The progressive politics, which underpin social purpose, had been allowed to seep into the workplace. Okay. The politicization of the workplace. And social purpose was simply a manifestation of that. You're talking about our leadership. Listen to this. This is a brilliant quote from 2 weeks ago from Sarah Carter, head of global planning, Adam and Eve DDB. Adam and Eve, you should know, did all of the John Lewis advertising. This is Sarah Carter, hugely respected woman. That whole collective losing of our marbles over the purpose period. It would be quite good to have a COVID-like purpose inquiry. So why exactly did we do that? Because we should learn from it. To me, it's just a function of a lack of market orientation. We've just got to get comfortable with our insignificance in people's lives and that, we influence the least important decisions that people make. And the best thing we can hope for is they chuck our brand in their basket without thinking about it. And that's fine. But instead we want other people to think like we think about life. And we want them to feel that what we might be important is important. It's terrifying, really, when you think about what that whole period did in terms of waste of money and the implications of waste of profit. Now that is a damning indictment from one of our leaders. I wish it had come 4 years ago.
Yeah. So young people coming in have brought a kind of university culture, politics, and all of that to the advertising industry. You've got social purpose marketing, which became at least fashionable, with very flimsy evidence behind it. You've got a failure of leadership because nobody really, apart from you and some.
And I wasn't a leader. I was very much an outsider.
Right, but there was some pushback, but it was very difficult to push back. The other thing that should the other corrective measures would have been your industry press, which also failed. It seems like the advertising awards people forgot to think about whether selling stuff was a factor in whether you were in success or not. The other one of the last self-correct mechanisms should be employment tribunals. If this is leaking into your HR policies. So there was one really important case in 2021 which involved the agency J. Walter Thompson, which is owned by WPP. This is from The Guardian. That the headline is Ad Men Sacked to Improve Gender Pay Gap Win Sex Discrimination Claim. It says 2 white male creative directors at a top London advertising agency, which was JWT, have won a sex discrimination claim after a presentation to a diversity conference pledged to obliterate its Mad Men reputation of being full of straight white men because bosses, in quotes, urgently wanted to address its poor gender pay gap, a tribunal court ruled. A female creative director was appointed when the company wanted to shake off its reputation as a, quotes, Knightsbridge boys club where, quotes, white straight men create above the line advertising.
My reading of it is that when they heard that the white male heterosexuals were to be obliterated from J. Walter Thompson, they immediately got in touch. They wrote to argue that point. And their querying of it was regarded as antagonistic and opposition to the diversity program. And they were then called in 2 days later and made redundant. The sad postscript to that is that the female, and I won't name her because she's had enough shit, the female who stood up and made this speech was thrown under the bus. I think that's the general conclusion. She copped some terrible criticism for making that speech, when in fact she was simply articulating the policy of the holding company, who got off kind of scot-free, who in a way diverted attention from themselves, or it could be said to have diverted attention onto the lady who made the speech. I think it goes to the point that you, Mr. Morrison, on your podcasts have said that there's good DEI and bad DEI, and the bad DEI comes when, primarily because people don't understand the Equality Act of 2010. I think Mr. Morrison said less than 10% of people who work in DEI might have a good understanding of it. And I think that this was a classic example of bad DEI, where you get activists who come in with their own agenda and, in this case, brutally impose it upon the personnel. So I think in this case, that was a classic example of protecting women and totally disregarding the protected characteristics of white men.
What I'm hearing you saying is that it's possible that the Equality Act is being misinterpreted to suggest that some groups should be given jobs above other people, which is not actually the law in this country. The law in this country is that you're allowed to do positive action, but not positive discrimination. And that we don't have laws to protect Black people that don't also protect white people. And if your HR people within advertising are kind of swimming in the water of social purpose advertising, it's possible that they are skewed towards thinking that the Equality Act is there to stick up for people who are possibly been historically more likely to be discriminated against, not realizing the fundamental importance of the structure of the Act, which is there is no hierarchy among the 9 protected characteristics, and it can be anybody who's discriminated against on any of those grounds.
Yes.
So I think there might be a fundamental misunderstanding there and losing their way in terms of what the actual goal is in terms of recruitment, and trying to, just as they're trying to make society reflect a world that they wish it was, they're also trying to make their company reflect the world as they wish it was.
Yes.
So that might be kind of incentivizing, that might be creating perverse incentives, it might be encouraging them to break the rules between things like positive action versus positive discrimination, in the belief, I suppose, that they think they're doing the right thing. that they think they're on the right side of history. It's this sort of idea, this grandiose, I don't know if it's grandiose, maybe it's kind of earnest, this idea that they're trying to do their bit to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
But there does seem to be possible
But they're
to
breaking the
create.
law.
Yeah.
And it's divisive.
Yes, it is divisive. It is
And
divisive.
just to add something to what you said, that I don't think that what's happening in our HR and DEI is social purpose leaking in. I think that progressive politics is responsible. It explains both social purpose and DEI, and it's progressive politics that are leaking into HR and DEI. Do you understand the distinction?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. You were telling me when we spoke before, you were telling me about how with casting, we see a lot more mixed race families on TV, which I mean, I think is a good thing. But what you're saying is that if you look at the numbers, it is actually disproportionate and it's not reflective of our actual society. Is that right? Can you tell me more about those numbers?
Yeah, I mean, as far as our casting is concerned, in the name of diversity, now they over-index on black and mixed race, and under-index on South Asian. South Asian people generally are pretty invisible on our TV screens. Again, our taking the knee-jerk reaction to Black Lives Matter was the black presence, which is absent in the boardroom, was then immediately projected onto our TV screens. I think it's simply because our advertising is, as I've said, compensating for its own failings at board level, at senior level, which are very true, by putting black and mixed race people on our screens.
So in pursuing social purpose in adverts and demographic diversity among their workforce, you've said to me before that you think that actual diversity of thought, opinion, background is pretty scarce at the moment, and that is part of the reason why there isn't very much challenge going on, because people can't discuss things properly. Do you think, for example, it's probably quite difficult from what you're saying to be an open Trump supporter, for example, or an open Brexiteer, or a pro-lifer, or even be openly I don't know, Christian maybe? What do you think that says? Do you think people generally who are from those backgrounds don't go into this industry, or if they do, they just keep quiet once they get in? What's it like being from one of those groups if you're working in advertising right now?
You just keep quiet. As you know, I stick the occasional post on LinkedIn, and people message me via the message system who simply can't like. It's not a case if they can't comment. They certainly can't like the things that I'm saying. And I've had CEOs telling me that they would be fired from their organization by the holding company. These are CEOs who run agencies, but they are owned by, as I said, that structure of the holding company, like the guy who pulled the ads from GB News. They could be fired for even endorsing views that are contrary to the monoculture, the groupthink, the progressive groupthink. I got one email which was frightening. With regards to HR, I am less concerned about them actively monitoring me and more worried I'll have it from someone who views my work profile here and reaches out to cause them trouble. So they're worried about people reading stuff that you put on LinkedIn that will then be reported back to your employers. I mean, it's kind of Orwellian, isn't it? The instance of somebody that I know who is at board level and is a practicing Christian, and she tells me that if she actually revealed her staunch faith, then that would be possibly a bump on the road in her career path.
I suspect it's probably not much fun being gender critical either in the advertising industry.
No, not whatsoever. No.
Even though we know that that's a protected belief.
Yeah. And there's an interesting one about the policing of words. I spoke to one a young copywriter who actually said that he was hauled over the coals by the line manager for saying, "And who's going to do the donkey work?"
Is that offensive to donkeys?
Well, no, it is offensive to the person. It's deriding, and it's not very inclusive. It's a microaggression. It's punching downwards, right? I don't think it is, but it became a point of disciplinary action.
I could throw in one myself. I've got a friend who was working at a design agency, and she used the word urban to describe the campaign, and somebody assumed that she meant black, I think, which she didn't. But anyway, she basically got called in and got told off for that. So,
well, it wouldn't be urban if it was Blackpool, would it? That was an assumption as well, that you'll only find black people in inner cities, kind of like that in itself is a microaggression.
Yeah. Well, you probably didn't see me being called a white supremacist on LinkedIn the other day for using the phrase most reasonable people. I don't know.
Well,
I mean, I felt there was a big leap, but the people I was talking to did not, because I questioned something. But I mean, I understand. This is the extremes of it, and it's not that bad in every company. It's not that bad in every industry. But there are places where things have gone crazy, and people think we're exaggerating. We're really not, because there's a lot of it around. People being told off for saying "hi, gents" or "ladies and gents," and anything like that. It's just, I think it just makes people feel that they're constantly on edge because they might say the wrong thing. And I find it very difficult to imagine that in something like advertising, you're getting the best from people, because if you can't throw ideas around freely, then presumably you can't really do great work. So why do you think there haven't been more court cases and employment tribunals if the culture is as bad as you say?
Well, I would have thought that if I've got a problem and I feel like I'm being discriminated against, who am I going to go to? HR? If HR, as you and I have identified, have not got a handle on these issues, right? Aren't really doing their job properly. Can I go to HR for guidance on what happens, on how I rectify this? So I go externally and I seek legal advice to an employment lawyer. And that'll be another 500 quid just for the phone call. And if it does eventually come to tribunal and you do take it to court, you're playing against people who have got limitless supplies of money, who would fight tooth and nail against anything that would damage their reputation on the issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay? They would rather be accused of fraud than committing than committing a crime against the progressive values which drive our industry. And I've been to court with networks, not about anything related to what we've spoken today. And it's a frightening prospect. You're playing with the richest gamblers at the table. And if you win, you'll never work in this town again, right?
Do you think?
Yeah. Who's going to take you on? You're a whistleblower. When you send that CV off to HR, where's the bin?
But what we seem to be rewarding kind of cowardice and punishing courage and difference, and we just seem to have lost our way completely now.
Yes.
But the mechanisms.
That's how organisations work. Yes,
I know. But the mechanisms that we thought, all the self-correct mechanisms, all seem to have failed one by one. Is that what you're saying? And now we end up in a situation where it sounds like your industry has just completely lost its way.
I would hate to quote Billy Yates, but because this is it's such a cliche, but the best lack all conviction, while the worst are filled with a passionate intensity. Do you understand? The nub of it for me is because we are such a graduate dependent industry, we are taking on board people who are either directly influenced or certainly conscious of the dominant ideology that has obtained in our universities in the UK and the US for the past 10, 15 years, and that is critical social justice. It's a, it's, it's a view which is discriminatory, reductive, and divisive. And it is one that has taken hold of our graduates. And I think it is one that lies at the heart of the progressive creep through our institutions, advertising being just one of them.
Yeah. Again, I'm just going to push back because I do think 20-somethings have, or at least should have, limited power in any industry and in any organization. And I think in lots of industries, what I'm seeing is that people in their 40s and 50s lost their confidence at the exact moment that they really, really needed it. And I think that was partly because of tech, because young people came in and they knew how to work all this stuff. And so we kind of, I'm 45, we kind of went, oh, they're so know so much more than us. And we were so worried about being left behind. And then in terms of our views, being seen as a dinosaur, that we kind of thought, oh, well, let's just follow their lead. And I think that was a huge mistake. I think we should have been a bit more skeptical and thought, hang on a minute, some of this doesn't sound quite right. I don't really get this. I think by the time we realized that some of this stuff is actually quite damaging and quite divisive, it was too late because it was already everywhere. At the same time as we'd created a culture in most industries, in fact, very similarly, where challenge is taboo. You can't question the orthodoxy.
Yeah.
But now I think there's increasing understanding that has happened. I'm not sure about advertising. I think it might be a little bit behind, as is publishing, I think. But I think there seems to be a move. There are moments like Bud Light and like Jaguar, where it becomes so obvious that something has gone terribly wrong here, that at some point there's going to need to be a course correction, or the entire industry is going to tank. So, what are your broader predictions? Do you think we're going to move back to a time of more fun advertising?
Undoubtedly, the bubble has burst on social purpose advertising. Completely. System One are the most respected arbiters of what will land with public. They're a research company, and they've told us that every ad must be about fun, which again I think is is a nonsense. But the whole point, the shift has been back towards ads that are entertaining. Okay, that's our role now, is the great entertainers.
Well, that also sounds like a bit of a fad, but it sounds like a better fad.
It is completely. It is completely. Yeah.
Presumably, you would support that.
No, I think what it will produce is a load of silly advertising. It will be from hyper seriousness to hyper silliness, which will have the same effect on the general public. What the hell is that about? The progressive use of advertising to project its political views is finished, essentially. But what I'm saying is that progressive influence on the advertising industry is now, I think, ingrained in our HR and our DEI. And that for me is something that will have to be addressed. And I'm not quite sure whether that is going to be an easy one at all.
While I've got you, I just want to ask about Trump. You don't see the advertising industry deciding to challenge the way that the American public have gone, the way that the American public have voted. You don't see them deciding to start their own campaign to say that Kamala should have won or anything like that.
Oh, no, not at all.
So they did get the message. That's not what the American people want.
They will just double down internally, kind of. I mean, they are so invested in the groupthink that they cannot see any reason why. I mean, this again is why the Democrat Party have failed to beat Trump, is that they can't see any merit in the things that he says in his appeal, his general appeal to the public. They are so invested in their own self-righteousness as well. The righteousness of their message, that they are on the right side of history. And when it looks frighteningly like the right side of history has been actually occupied by people who do not agree with them, it makes them even more defensive, I think.
I don't know. I wondered whether if the advertising industry, people behave like the DEI people and like we're seeing the Democrats behaving in terms of just doubling down, that they might start coming out with lots of pro-LGBT stuff. You know, the community needs us more now than ever. Lots of pro-migrant stuff, that kind of pro-demographic diversity, particularly racial diversity. No, you don't see them trying to
honestly,
wage a
believe
war
me,
against
that
that.
boat has sailed. That boat has
It's
sailed.
gone. Okay.
There will be humor is back. You know,
Right.
There's a big thing. You know, it would be a good idea if we made humorous ads. Well, you know, kind of,
That's what sells
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
you know, so no shit. You
All
know,
right.
that people like to be entertained. Oh, no shit. You know.
Great. All right. Then, in wrapping up, how would you conclude now the progressive politics that was what started social purpose? Social purpose seems to be on the wane, but you think it's now it's deep in the institutions and will probably take a while to
Yeah.
course correct. Do you think that will happen in time for the industry to be sort of saved or rejuvenated in a way that makes it more sustainable for the future?
My hope would be that diversity, equity, and inclusion shifts from being demographically focused to class focused. That's what the industry needs. A huge influx of people who would give us the cognitive diversity that we need, and that is the 45% of the population who are working class, the working class of all colours. I think we need that infusion. But I don't think the white working class are on anyone's top of anyone's list, because to our progressive friends, they are Brexit voting, Boris liking, flag waving, express reading dullards, you know, and who wants them hanging around the agency?
Do you think that the advertising world's ability to course correct in that direction will be the thing that either makes or breaks it in terms of having a future or not?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I guess they better crack on with it then, hadn't they?
I think they better. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, listen, Steve, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Lots of wisdom, not an industry that I know. And again, you know, possibly people within your world will disagree with you. I just find you a fabulous guest and I've learned so much. So thank you so much.
No,
I really appreciate your time.
thank you for having me. Thank you.